Did you ever get in trouble for doing the right thing? It happens often. Whistleblowers get in trouble for telling the truth. Whistleblowers lose their jobs. The same goes for people who tell the boss what the boss does not want to hear. Don't shoot the messenger, we say. I didn't cause the problem. I just wanted you to know about it. But often messengers get shot, don't they? Or the doctor who stops along the roadside to assist in an accident that has occurred and then ends up on the wrong side of a lawsuit against him because he stopped to help someone and it didn't go perfectly well. We have a phrase for that too. No good deed goes unpunished. And that's kind of what happened to the disciples in our gospel reading for today in this well-known story, both of Jesus walking on the water, the wind on the waves on the sea, and the story of Peter walking on the water. It says that Jesus ordered the disciples to get into the boat after a long day. This is a scene set in the context of feeding the 5,000. And now after this long day and this huge catering issue, they're forced into the boat. Jesus orders them into the boat in the evening, and he doesn't join them. He dismisses the crowd by himself, and then he goes off to pray. It was Jesus' idea, not their idea, to get into the boat. The disciples start their journey at nightfall simply because Jesus asked them to. They weren't being foolish, they were being obedient. Now keep in mind that it had been a really, really big day. If you've had to entertain 5,000 people, which I don't think anybody here has probably done, you can imagine how exhausting it would be, especially when you weren't sure exactly where all this food was going to come from, and then suddenly having to serve 5,000. So when Jesus asked them this, I'm sure there was a couple of ughs and uhs and reallys that came out of this group of disciples that they had to get in the boat and make their way across the Sea of Galilee. They're on the Sea of Tiberias, or the Sea of Galilee, or Lake Galilee. It's a body of water that's about 13 miles long and about 8 miles wide. And it says that they were many stadia. That's the word that is used for the distance that they had gone. You don't get that in the text because it wouldn't make any sense to you. But a stadia is about 600 feet. And according to John's gospel of this story, they had gone about 25 stadia. So in terms of my math, it would be somewhere about 3 miles. They're about halfway across the Sea of Galilee when there's a contrary wind, it's called. Contrary wind means it just didn't work for them. They're in a boat that just won't go because the winds just whip around them. If you've ever been on the Sea of Galilee or in that area, you know that the way the canyons focus the wind coming down on it, suddenly the winds are just kind of cast through these canyons right onto the surface of the water and can quickly kick up a huge windstorm with whitecaps. We were there, we got on the boat, and it was like a sheet of glass. And after the boat ride, as we were going, one of these winds whipped up. It was almost as if they turned a switch to have it happen. And by the time we disembarked, it was very difficult to get off the boat without, rocking away because the winds were battering the boat. So I get it. And if you've ever been on a small boat when there's been some heavy waves, maybe you get it as well. It says that the wind was against them. Again, the better word is contrary, meaning if they were trying to sail and you have a contrary wind, there's no way to kind of set your sail against it because it's constantly changing. They're rowing against it. The boat is being buffeted by the waves and by the wind. They're making little headway. They're about halfway, and you can imagine if you've ever been in a boat with a group of people, what happens when you don't make very good headway? The group turns on itself, right? They're like, we should go back. We should go back. We're only 25 stadia. We're only like 3 miles. It's got about 3 miles out, or we could go 3 miles back versus 5 miles across. We should go back. And the other group's like, no, we've come this far. Jesus told us to go across. So the group's kind of bickering, I'm sure, by this point, frustrated by the fact that many of them are fishermen and they can't make any headway against this storm. Plus, they've worked all day long in a very draining situation. They haven't had any sleep. There's no possibility for them to sleep in this buffeted boat. And you can imagine how exhausted they would be. And it was night. There's darkness. So this isn't a boat that has, fog lights or something. This is a boat that has no lights, in essence. They're trying to make their way. Now, these sailors would have understood to sail with the stars, like all sailors, even on this small body of water, but with a wind-whipped up surf, it probably was kind of difficult to even see where they were at. They were probably disoriented, probably a little concerned about if they were still traveling in a straight course or if they had lost their bearings. And so you can imagine when it gets to be just about dawn, now these guys have rowed against this wind all night long. When the first glimmer of light comes, they must have begun to feel some relief to know where they were on this body of water. Even though all this is against them, if you notice the emotions in the passage, they're not afraid. They don't seem to be afraid of this storm. These sailors have seen dangers. These fishermen have fished these waters. They know what it's like. They know both how to do it, but they also appreciate all the dangers that are involved in it. Some of them must have been asking themselves, why in the world would Jesus send us out here in the middle of the night, in the middle of a windstorm, knowing that this could happen in the middle of the night without him, without any sleep? I imagine that they began questioning the wisdom that Jesus had. And as we read this story, we need to know that these stories are put in place by the author to help the community to whom he's writing, in this case, Matthew's gospel. Matthew's community, by the time that Matthew is writing, the city of Jerusalem has already been sacked. The population of Israel has been dispersed by the Romans. And at this point, the Romans are persecuting both Jews and Christians. Remember the Colosseum. So those Christians, like the disciples in the boat, are trying to obey Jesus, but like the men in the boat, they are caught up in a storm that is not their own doing. Like the disciples in the boat, they're trying to make their way across in things, but things are going from bad to worse. The story of the disciples in the boat was also, in a sense, a parallel story to the situation in which Matthew's church was finding itself, buffeted by the waves of circumstance and politics. So he's telling really two stories at once, lying in parallel to one another. A message about something that happened in the life of Jesus, but also a lesson that would lie almost like a parable to the situation in which Matthew's church found themselves. If the disciples were in the boat asking themselves why Jesus had ordered them into the boat at such an inopportune time, Matthew's church was probably also wondering why Jesus had ordered them to live in this situation at this very inopportune time, a time of persecution. If the disciples felt that in the boat were suffering for no reason of their own, only because they were trying to do the right thing of obeying Jesus, I can only imagine how the church at that time felt like they were trying to do the right thing following Jesus and they were getting no reward from it. Instead, only hardship and persecution. So in a sense, it's as if Matthew's telling two stories lying on tracks parallel to one another, but in another way, he's actually telling many stories, isn't he? The story of Jesus walking on the water and the storm on the sea and Peter walking on the water, the boat buffeted, Matthew's community buffeted by the waves of change and persecution, but then we can hear some of our own story in it, can't we? We know that there are times as a disciple that we get buffeted by things that were not of our own doing. That we often fall into that trap that we think because we have faith that God would bless us, which usually means some prosperity of some type or some kind of easy life, and yet that's not what we're getting. You might think that Jesus wouldn't allow Christians to suffer, but he does. It happens every day. We're becoming more and more aware of it every day, of Christians being persecuted, as they were among the Romans at the Romans' time. Now we're becoming aware of persecution in many nations: Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Malaysia, Nigeria, Iraq. Christians are being persecuted in China and India and many other places. Their only crime? Trying to obey Jesus. They're very much like the disciples on the boat. So maybe these parallel tracks aren't just like train tracks. Maybe they're a whole set of tracks in which we begin to see the connection to not just the story of the disciples and Jesus, not just the story of Matthew's church that was suffering persecution, but the church in the world today, or perhaps in the hardships of our own life. This last week, about a dozen of us went to Mexico for a mission, San Diego, and to Mexico for a mission. We went to Miracle Ranch, which is in Tecate. It's an orphanage for Mexican children. And we met a man of passionate faith there, a man who took a risk with a mission to which he was called. He's the owner of this small, poor orphanage, but he believes that it's God's mission for him, and that God will provide for that mission, and he's done so for over 25 years. It's rarely easy. The needs are always outpacing their resources. The facilities are in chronic disrepair, and yet the life of the community that's there, these children who all had difficult backgrounds and were in the midst of hard childhoods, lived in a community that was affirming, so that there wasn't a bad kid among them. They were open-hearted and loving and compassionate, not just with each other, but with the dozen of us that had just showed up for the week. It was amazing. It had a huge impact upon our kids, the way in which they lived so simply, without so much, and with such joy. In fact, my kid, who's like pretty much got a screen for a head because he's so electronically oriented, said at the end of the week, you know, this is the least I've ever played with electronics in, I think, my entire life, and I've never been happier. Cesar, one of the most, is the owner, so part of the most unforgettable part was his story, recalling difficulty after difficulty, and we'll tell these stories over the months ahead, I'm sure, but every time he talked about difficulty, he also talked about and gave witness to his faith, saying that God always provided, always cares, always is faithful for his love with them. Even if things didn't go right, even in the midst of tragedy, somehow they found God's provision in the midst of it. And it showed in the lives of those orphan children, and it showed in the lives of that staff. Like that little ship, this one not surrounded by water, but buffeted by a desert. The winds against them in so many different ways, and yet Christ was with them. And they were a profound community, and they were not afraid. So the story of the disciples in the boat is many stories. It's the story of Matthew's church. It's the story of the church around the world. It's the story of Cesar and Miracle Ranch, of faithful Christians around the world today undergoing hardship. It might be your story too, trying to follow Jesus, but experiencing hardship and difficulty and not the kind of blessing that you're expecting to receive. Maybe it's hardships that you hadn't ever hoped to experience, or the kind of hardship that you wouldn't think would happen to a person of faith, like depression, or maybe the breakdown of a marriage, or maybe the lives of your children are unraveling or going in the wrong direction, or any number of many things. These things happen, don't they? And one of the lessons to take from a story like this one is, like Matthew's church, to say, these things happen in our lives. We're not insulated from them. We're not taken out of them. Even as faithful Christians, we experience hardship and difficulty. In the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 5, he says God makes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. And I think we need to hear that, because often we think, maybe I've done something wrong. Why would God do this to me if I hadn't done something wrong? And maybe I'm being punished or corrected or pruned in some way. And that may be the case, but more often than not, it's just the fact that difficult things happen. Painful things happen. Death happens in many and various ways in this life, and they can cause us to be afraid. But it is not God punishing us. Jesus said, God makes the rain to fall upon the evil and on the good, just as he makes the sun to shine upon the just and the unjust. And it's important for us to understand that, because sometimes as Christians, especially religious people, we consciously or unconsciously link these kind of thinking as we're looking at some poor soul and we're talking about their sin and their brokenness in their life. And sometimes we ratchet down on those types of conclusions. The fact is that you do not know. Contemporary phrase is, it's beyond your pay grade to know that. You can't know the cosmic reason behind the suffering in the life of someone else. It's beyond us. And some suffering, of course, stems from poor choices and brokenness. It's just obvious. But that's not always the case. We live in a world in which joy and sorrow, they live right next to each other. We experience at any one given time some of both, don't we? Even good Christians sometimes find themselves in the middle of raging storms that are not of their making. They did not bring them on. They did not create them, and they're not exactly sure how they're going to disperse it. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Everyone, therefore, who hears these words of mine and does them will be like the wise man who builds his house upon the rock, and the rains came down, and the floods arose, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it did not fall because it was founded upon the rock." Did you notice that the wise man also suffers calamity? But his house is founded somewhere than upon himself or upon the winds of change. He doesn't promise us that our lives will be easy or pain-free, but he does promise that he will be with us in the midst of the storm. And that's a story that Cesar at Miracle Ranch testified to with story after story after story of how God was faithful in the midst of a storm or a need or a difficulty. And in the story, I think it's fascinating to me that the disciples aren't afraid in the storm. When I've been on a boat with my uncle in Lake Erie and there was a storm, I was in the bottom of the boat. I was so afraid, even as a large teenager, in the bottom of the boat, clinging on for dear life. But they weren't afraid. Did you notice when they became afraid? When Jesus comes walking on the water, they are terrified. Now they're out of their depth. Now these salty fishermen are beyond what they understood. This was something completely new. And they tried to categorize it in ways that would make sense. It's a ghost. But I think one of the pieces that we can pull out of the story is that sometimes the difficulties of this life are things that we get used to, and so they don't really frighten us. It's when God walks in that things get really shaken up. And that's when we really get unnerved, because we're not sure what he wants from us, or what this presence means, or what his power and his presence will demand of us. It's startling what Jesus asks. Hey, if it's you, Jesus, ask me to come to you. Peter speaks for all of us. Okay, Peter, come on. And Peter gets out of the boat and walks upon the water with his eyes fixed upon Jesus. Now, even the best of us can't keep our eyes fixed upon Jesus. If St. Peter can't, then you should give yourself a break. The story is trying to tell us that we waver too, just like Peter does. His name is the great juxtaposition for how we find ourselves. Simon, meaning shifting sands, and Peter, Petros, the rock. We are some days the rock, and some days we are quicksand. And we waver between faith and doubt, between fixing our eyes on Jesus and keeping them there, and eyeing nervously the threatening waves that are battering the boat. We get it. We fail. Peter fails, but he does step out in faith. And notice that he doesn't jump back for the boat. Who does he ask for? He doesn't say, "Throw me the life preserver, extend a row." Lord, save me. And he does. We are called too to step out in faith, to do something with our lives, something beyond just taking care of ourselves and making it through our retirement funds. There's something more important about your life than just making it or living in abundance or luxury. Sometimes we're called to move to Tecate, Mexico, and open an orphanage, even though Cesar and his wife lived in Minnesota. They chose to go to this plot of land because God called them to do something about children that were overlooked, that were left out. We nervously eye the threatening realities when those calls come to us. We begin to say, but what about this, and what about that, and the problem with this is, and what about this, and I don't think we have enough money for that, and there's never enough, and well, we really need to be planning this out a lot better, and all that stuff begins to keep us clinging to the side of the boat, right? We've now tethered ourselves inside the boat, like me on Lake Erie, nervously in the bottom of the boat, hoping that we don't capsize. But Jesus calls the church, he calls us to risk-taking mission and service in his name. He calls us to walk on water from time to time, to go to Tecate and to do what is impossible to do. And yet for 25 years, they've been doing it. Jesus challenges us to do something with this one life that we're given, other than to care for ourselves. Jesus calls the church to some water walking, to some risk-taking mission for the sake of the world that needs the light of Christ. Oh, and the world is going to be startled when you show up, and sometimes the world's even going to be afraid when you show up, and sometimes the world will persecute you when you show up, and they will hate you when you show up, because sometimes the light of the world is at first startling and alarming before it brings peace and calm to the storm. The one thing that Jesus doesn't do is give up on the disciples, although he gently chides Peter for his wee little faith. And so we aren't to give up on the world, even though we eye nervously a world that seems to be coming apart at the seams. He calls us to live in faith and to walk in love with our eyes fixed upon him. He tells us that he will be present with us. In fact, the word that he uses, the Greek word, is ego eimi, which is literally, don't be afraid, I am. I am. If you know your Bible, you know that that's kind of a pregnant phrase. It comes from Exodus 3, when Moses is before the burning bush, and Moses is like, I have a stammer, I'm not really good, I got a little tendonitis, I get a sore throat off, and I can't go and speak for you. Like, really right now, I think allergies are taking over. And finally he agrees and says, well, who am I supposed to say I'm talking to here? They're going to put me in a rubber room. What does God answer? Tell them that I am who I am sent you. I am sent you. And so when Jesus says to them, do not fear, I am, he's not just saying, I made it through the waves. He's saying, the very life of God is present in the waves and on the water and in the midst of fear. And when we don't understand, and when we stepped out in faith and we're sinking in the waves, and when we have to cry out for an oar or a lifesaver or for our Savior to reach out and take our hands, I am is present with us, always in the midst of the storm. What's funny about storms, and I've had some storms in my life, although certainly after a week like we had in Mexico, my storms have taken on a whole new perspective. But what's interesting about the storms of our life is it's in those places that we get the edges knocked off, sort of the sharp edges. It shapes us. And sometimes the things that I did not wish would happen in my life become the very pulse of the place where God relates to people best through me. It's not what I would choose. It's not what I would want. And at the time, I was terribly afraid of those things, and yet it has become the place of the pulse of God for many people in my life. And I know that's the case for many of you. God doesn't save us from difficulty. Sometimes the easy way leads to no learning. At least for me. Maybe I'm just more, hard-headed than most of you. But the way of pain and the way of the chisel and the hammer are the things that really have shaped my life and have made me realize that it's not me who's done these things, but God, the I am, who's active in and through me. Nobody enjoys the storms. You don't have to go looking for them. The storms will show up. You don't have to go find them. But in the midst of the storm, don't also give up on yourself or your church, the people gathered in the boat with you, or with Christ. Because God has not given up on us, as he didn't give up on those 12 and that one crazy guy who decided to step out of the boat and to do that which was impossible. But he did it. I become aware that I'm who I am because of what God's done. And I know many of your stories, and I know that that's how you feel about yourself. And that's what happens with Peter, who's such a lughead, but becomes the very anchor for the church in Israel in the 1st and 2nd century. And so the encouragement is, whatever storm you might be experiencing, be aware that Christ is always present. I am is always with us. He comes to help you, he comes to change you, he comes to redeem you, he comes to save you, and he comes with that same message he gave to Matthew's church as he gave to the disciples in that boat. Take heart, be of good courage. It is I, the very presence of God in your midst. You don't need to be afraid. Amen.